Hello, this is Todd Luck, and are you interested in the works of Robert E. Howard, but you find Conan to be too sinful for you, with all the womanizing and the drinking and the swearing on the names of heathen gods? No, you want to read about a hero who is pious and righteous and a man of God, but for some reason still ends up killing a hell of a lot of bad people because for some reason God's down with that. Well, I've got the hero for you. It's Robert E. Howard's Puritan adventurer, Solomon Kane. This is a guide to all of the Solomon Kane comics that I know of that exist and how you can get them and read them for yourself. And it's a surprisingly small amount of comics, but I'm going to include a list of everything I talk about in the description for this video. And I'm also, after we talk about the comics, I'm also going to talk about why there's so few comics and how if history had gone just a little bit different, this would be a much longer video. Believe it or not, Solomon Kane actually predates Cole and Conan. He actually first appeared in the Robert E. Howard prose story Red Shadows in 1928 in the pulp magazine Weird Tales. Solomon Kane actually predates Robert E. Howard's creation of the sword and sorcery genre, which combines elements of horror and fantasy together and is considered to be just a horror character. And so he differs from Robert E. Howard's later characters like Cole and Conan. Cole and Conan are in fictional time periods created by Robert E. Howard. Solomon Kane exists in real historic times. And so we'll often see Conan as this callous, bloodthirsty mercenary and thief and scoundrel. But Solomon Kane is actually a good person. He is a righteous man. And don't get me wrong, he's got to pay the innkeeper like everyone else. And so he does take his mercenary jobs and all that. But most Solomon Kane stories that we see are based around him dispensing justice, which he does free of charge. Righteous indignation is kind of his pastime. And lastly, Conan and Cole stories tend to have the barbarian heroes fighting some kind of supernatural evil and conquering it in some fashion. Solomon Kane does that sometimes, but it's not a requirement of a Solomon Kane story. Sometimes the evil is dealt with in completely different ways. He may be delivered by some other supernatural force. He may actually just be a witness to the supernatural evil. Solomon Kane's stories are about this righteous, God-fearing man realizing that the world is bigger and scarier than anything in his belief system. And so when it comes to Robert E. Howard comics, obviously Conan is king. Conan has so many comics that have been put out in the last 55 years, it's almost impossible for the average person to have them all. And I've done a video guide to Cole comics, and Cole does have a decent body of work in comics. However, it is much smaller than Conan, and it is possible to get all the Cole comics over time. But with Solomon Kane, there's actually not that many comics, and it is very easy to get them all and read them all. In fact, I'm going to give you one recommendation that's going to cover a third of the stories that have been published with Solomon Kane. And that is the Saga of Solomon Kane trade paperback. This is from Dark Horse. And don't worry, I'll cover your Omnibus recommendations at the end. But this is a collection of all of the short stories that ran in Marvel's magazines, most notably Savage Sword of Conan. And so this is actually most of the material that Marvel published of Solomon Kane in one volume. Now, if you're like me, you've probably got an issue of Savage Sword here and there. You've fished out of back issue bins that have Solomon Kane stories in it. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, look, this says there's only 20 stories in here. So I bet I could just go and get all the back issues instead of getting this collection. The problem with that is a lot of Solomon Kane stories are in the oldest and rarest magazines that Marvel put out. So his first appearance was in Monsters Unleashed #1, followed by Dracula Lives #3, both published in 1973, followed by issues 2 and 3 of Cole and the Barbarians, before he started appearing in Savage Sword of Conan in short stories, starting with issue 13. And so all I had to do was look at the cost of getting one of those issues. And I was like, nope, I'm good with getting the trade paperback because this is the way more affordable way to read those short stories. And one of the coolest things about this trade is that the short stories were accompanied by text pieces that tell you where they took place in Solomon Kane's life. Now, most of them are published in chronological order to when they happened for Solomon Kane, but this was something that I never knew was the case with Solomon Kane. I thought it was just a bunch of short stories, so it's kind of cool that they kind of come together to tell the life story of this Puritan adventurer and is truly the Saga of Solomon Kane. And if you're familiar with Marvel, Solomon Kane, you may know that his final appearances for Marvel was in Savage Sword 219 and 220, which was a crossover with Conan. And actually, Savage Sword 220 was my first time ever seeing Solomon Kane back in the day. And I wasn't sure if this would be included because it is kind of a Conan story, but I am happy to say it is absolutely in this Solomon Kane collection. And it's fantastic because this is Roy Thomas's adaptation of the Solomon Kane fragment, Death's Black Riders, but it also follows up on the Solomon Kane story, Moon of Skulls. And this trade paperback was the first time I'd read Moon of Skulls, so this actually gave me the first opportunity I'd ever had to actually experience Death's Black Riders in full context and get all of the different references Roy was making. And Death's Black Riders is the final story in here and makes a very appropriate ending for the Saga of Solomon Kane. Marvel did put out a few color comics of Solomon Kane, starting with Marvel Premiere 33 and 34, which adapt Red Shadows. And if you're familiar with that story, you may be wondering what the heck is going on with this cover. So Roy Thomas, when he's adapting Red Shadows, actually adds a prologue set in Europe with some supernatural elements, and that's what you see on the cover. But Marvel Premiere 34 has a cover with Kane in Africa, which definitely looks a lot more like Red Shadows. And then in the 80s, Marvel put out a 6-issue Sword of Solomon Kane miniseries, and each issue is self-contained stories. Some of them are adaptations, and some of them are original stories, and it begins, of course, with another adaptation of Red Shadows. Incidentally, if you're thinking to yourself, Hellboy artist Mike Mignola would make the perfect Solomon Kane artist, he actually did do the artwork for issue 4 of this miniseries. And in my opinion, all of the issues are good in this miniseries. This is the miniseries that made me fall in love with Solomon Kane. The individual color issues are relatively affordable, but if you want to go the trade paperback route, Dark Horse did collect all of the color Solomon Kane issues from Marvel in a trade paperback called The Chronicles of Solomon Kane. Now, if you'd like all of the Solomon Kane comics, both color and black and white, from that original Marvel run in one volume, there is an omnibus called Solomon Kane, The Original Marvel Years. Now, this is out of print, so the prices may be all over the place. It retailed originally for $100, and you shouldn't have to pay too much more for it than that. But I will say that Titan Comics now has the rights to do Solomon Kane, and as we talk about in a minute, is putting out new material, and I expect at some point they will probably reissue this omnibus. And that was all of the Marvel comics of Solomon Kane that I know of from that era. But before we get to Dark Horse, we're going to take a little bit of a side trip in the 80s to BLACKTHORNE for Solomon Kane 3D. Now, this is one of the rarer Solomon Kane comics that came out. This is probably going to set you back about 25 bucks if you can find this on eBay. Oftentimes, you might have to get it from a foreign seller, but don't let this cover fool you. I know the cover's a little bit plain. This was actually an ad that they ran for this issue originally in 3D, and so it looks kind of plain when they just put it on the cover. But the interior artwork is professionally done. It looks like it's straight out of a Marvel Solomon Kane comic, and the story reads like it's a Marvel Solomon Kane comic too. It's well researched as far as the backstory of the character, and it's a good solid story, and the 3D effects are really spectacular. And then our Wandering Puritan's journey takes him to Dark Horse Comics, who, of course, will put out a series of miniseries of Solomon Kane. Each miniseries will be a serialized adaptation of a single Robert E. Howard short story. And so that's going to begin with a miniseries simply titled Solomon Kane. It's 5 issues and it adapts The Castle of the Devil. Next up is Dark Horse's version of Death's Black Riders that takes a more Lovecraftian approach to the fragment by Robert E. Howard. And the final 4-issue Solomon Kane miniseries is an adaptation of, say it with me kids, Red Shadows, because you can never have too many adaptations of that story. Now, one of the big differences between Dark Horse and Marvel is that Marvel had more realistic artwork and more detailed artwork, and the artwork on the Dark Horse comics tended to be a lot more stylized. Another big difference was that the miniseries were very decompressed, and each issue only had a very small amount of story, and so all of the issues were really meant to be read as a single unit of storytelling. So not everyone's probably going to dig the more abstract art on some of these comics, but I think the stories are certainly worth picking up regardless of what you think about the artwork. And back in the day, I did get a little bit annoyed about how little story was in each of the issues. You know, you would get a little bit of story and then have to wait a month to get a little bit more story, and you wouldn't get a conclusion until 4 or 5 months later. But guess what, kids? These are now back issues and trade paperbacks, and so you can pick up all the back issues at one time or pick up the trade paperback of each of these miniseries and read them at any pace you want to read them at, right? If you want to read them all in one setting, I think that's a fantastic way to do it. Dark Horse did put out 2 more Solomon Kane stories that I'm aware of, and those were short stories that ran in Robert E. Howard's Savage Sword. So the first one is in issue 8. And then the last one is in issue 10, and unfortunately this was the final issue of the series, and it's harder to find, so the price can be a little higher on this one. I got mine for I think about 20 bucks on an auction. You may see them for a little bit higher than that. And so after that, we have Solomon Kane's homecoming to Marvel Comics. So he does return to Marvel Comics along with the other Robert E. Howard properties. Unfortunately, he only appears as part of an ensemble cast in a single miniseries called Conan Serpent War that ran for 4 issues. And so after that, Solomon Kane would arrive at his new home and his current home at Titan Comics, and he would have short stories in the back of the first 4 issues of Titan Comics' Savage Sword of Conan. He also appears in the 4-issue miniseries Conan, Battle of the Black Stone. He's part of an ensemble cast of Robert E. Howard heroes again, but this time at least he gets to fight Conan. And currently there is a 4-issue miniseries called Solomon Kane, The Serpent Ring, and you've been looking at that first issue of it over my shoulder this entire video. The miniseries, as well as the short stories in those first 4 issues of Savage Sword, are done by Patch Zurcher, who, in my opinion, is doing some stellar work on Solomon Kane, so check it out. And so that's it for Solomon Kane Comics. There is a movie that I'll be reviewing at some point. It's simply called Solomon Kane. There are a couple of Solomon Kane action figures. One is from Mezco. It's their 112 Solomon Kane, and it's very nice, but it goes for well over $100. There's also a Mego-style figure in the World's Greatest Heroes line, but that's probably not going to be a whole lot cheaper at this point. And I think the thing that really strikes me about Solomon Kane is just how little material there is for how long this character has been around. And so for most of his comic career, he's only had short stories as backups in Savage Sword, but that actually wasn't Roy Thomas's original intention. While reading the letter columns in some 70s Cole comics, I found out that Roy actually had the intention for Savage Sword to be Conan stories, and Cole and the Barbarians were going to be the showcase for other Robert E. Howard characters like Cole, Solomon Kane, and Red Sonja. But of course that didn't happen. Cole and the Barbarians was very short-lived, and Solomon Kane was relegated to a sometimes backup feature for Conan's magazine. If the original plan had worked out, we probably would have had a lot more Solomon Kane material. Heck, maybe he would have even caught on and had an ongoing series we certainly would have more Solomon Kane stories. And typically, when something like that happens, you get a lot more stories with the character, like we're seeing with Red Sonja. Some of those stories are great stories we wouldn't have normally gotten, and then some of them are mediocre or just downright bad. And so it's kind of a mixed bag, but I definitely would have liked to have seen more Solomon Kane. All right, that's it for this guide to Solomon Kane comics. Like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.